Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. This is part one of the new WKO5 element series. I've been asked to do some simpler webinars with kind of like more focused topics and a shorter time agenda, so less time. You guys who know me well probably know that's not necessarily my forte. I was talking to Coley more about it today, but I'm going to give it a shot. We'll see how it goes. To me, it really is about trying to keep it focused, but a good discussion. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim Cusick. I am the WKO5 product leader. I'm also the head coach at joinbasecamp.com and velocious.com. I have been coaching for about 17, 18 years now. I've had the luxury of working with amazing athletes. I have a couple of world championships, world records, and a fair amount of national championships and stuff. So I've been doing the coaching thing for a while, and I've had the luxury of working with amazing athletes and getting some good results. That being said, everything you're going to hear is my opinion today, and just my opinion. I believe the purpose that we created WKO5 as an analytics engine is we really wanted people to be able to go out and to look at data, do analytics, and develop their own opinion based on a better ability to vet, to test, to discover stuff. And that's why sometimes, a lot of times I get the answer where people are like, just give me the chart. That's not what we're really here for, because that's how I coach, but I will show you some stuff. Just know it's my opinion. As we go throughout, particularly in these element programs, I think I only have about 12 slides, 15 slides, real slides. Please feel free to ask questions as we go by hitting the Q&A button. I am currently closing the chat button, so I'll only see Q&A. I am looking at it. Sometimes you'll see me look over here. I have a screen open showing the questions. Ask as we go so I can answer as we go. That's part of this. This elements program is more interaction, more discussion. If you're new to WKO5, this is kind of like jumping in the middle. I would highly recommend you go to WKO5.com. Look at the Education Center up top right and use these tabs, right? There is excellent information from getting started to how to individualize your training, how to coach. Here's really where I show you a step-by-step of my methodology, or general methodology using WKO5, some tracking, building analytics, and all the historical webinars. Like right now, I'm getting a lot of requests for annual planning webinars. I did one last year in 3 parts. So it's extensive. It's in there. Just make sure you click on the webinar, scroll down, take a look. All right. Wow, looks like everybody's joined. Big webinar. Love it. Let's start at its most basic. Today's topic is training load. So let's define what is training load. You know, in training, in endurance sports, we tend to use a lot of terms that we sort of know the definition, but we don't take the time to define, and there is a slight difference. So training load is the cumulative amount of stress placed on an individual from a single or multiple training sessions, structured or unstructured, over a period of time. So basically, you have common traits to training load. It's cumulative, it's placed on an individual, and it's single or multiple sessions, unstructured or structured. And that note that in things like intensity and frequency and stuff are part of that, but training load is not broken down into those parts. It's the cumulative version of all of that. When we think about training load, if I was to give you one basic lesson, and I answer this question a lot, I do it in a lot of my certification education and things like that. If I had to think about training load, the first thing I want to do is think about it in time nomenclature. And to me, that's always, and this should be the way we look at so much stuff in training, acute impacts and chronic impacts. Now, as we add training load, we want to watch both, because the reality is the response, both short and long-term, right? The response to acute training load and the response to chronic training load are related, but different. So write that down. You want to take note number 1. The response from acute training load and chronic training load are related, but different. So we need to go deeper into this. An acute training load really is just the absolute load over a short period of time. We typically use 7 to 12 days as determining that load. And it's why when you look at a performance manager chart, you see acute training load, ATL, being a default of 7. And people talk about ranging it out as we age and other factors. But the reality, the typical range is 7 to 12 days. And that's where our bodies, the individual, remember this is an individual, tends to really feel the impact of acute training load, 7 to 10 days, forward from that load. The second and more interestingly impactful when we begin to talk about training load is your chronic training load. And this is simply the absolute load that is applied over a longer period of time. And we use 42 days as the standard. Funny thing, in the Training Peaks Coach Facebook group, I saw this question being asked today: why do we use 40 days? Cody had a great answer, as always. He does a great job of answering questions. Back in the day when we were looking at, we're like, wow, people adapt to exercise somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks. And that basically, we took the number in the middle, which is 6 weeks, which is 42 days. That's pretty much the guide. Now, the reality is, I didn't put a range there. Here's why. There's actually more range in your chronic training load that's discussed. And one of the things I really plan on teaching people in 2022 is how to kind of figure that out. It is related to your acute training load, and it is related to your chronic. 42 is a good default, but there are some reasons you want to change that. And we'll talk about that. Here's my problem, right? I'm supposed to keep it short and simple. I'll do a more complex one in the early winter on this. But also, once we start thinking about this training load in an acute and chronic sense using time, let's think more about measuring it for the individual. And let's separate the idea of external stress and external load and internal load. Again, related, but different. External load is any external stimulus applied to the athlete that is measured independently of their internal characteristics. If I could go back in time, sit down at a table with Andy Coggin and say, Andy, when you release training stress score, make this sentence and print it on every single thing you do. And we would have saved a ton of confusion, particularly right now. Because there's also internal load. Internal load is load measurable by assessing internal response factors within the biological system, me, right, the individual, which may be physiological, psychological, and other. That internal load, so external load and internal load are related, but they're different. This is simply the measure, the external stimuli applied, right? Independent of internal characteristics. Independent of internal characteristics. This is about what the internal characteristics, what's happening inside when we apply load. That is the difference between stress, it's external, and strain. We apply stress to the system, right? We ride our bike at 200 watts, we run at 300 watts, we swim hard, fast, whatever, right? That's applying stress. What happens within us, muscular, cardiovascular, metabolic, that is strain. And when we think about this idea of measuring training load, right, we tend to think in a progressive overload format, meaning we want more, right? When we're talking about load, as soon as I say load, we see an image of something going up, don't we? Because that's what training is. The reality is we have very good mechanisms for measuring acute load with external stress. We have very good mechanisms for managing chronic load for external stress. Where we don't have answers is internal and strain. And I'm going to get deeper into this right now. And there lies a lot of our challenge and a lot of what's going on. There's a lot of dialogue right now and people being ongoingly critical about training stress score and some stuff. Here's the challenge, right? First, let's understand the stress-strain relationship in its most overly simplified way. You apply stress to the system undergoes strain, and then adaptation occurs, right? Keep it that simple. This step is an external load. We're going to go ride our bike at 200 watts. We're going to run at 300 watts, exactly like I'm saying, right? This is the internal load. Once I apply that stress, what happens? That strain is the internal load, and that leads to adaptation. But understand, strain leads to adaptation, not stress. See, here's the challenge. When we talk about training load, we have made it so easy to measure the external stress, training stress score. We called it stress score for a reason, right? But understand, load is neutral, but important. Load is neutral. So many people, and I even sort of, when Training Peaks named the PMC, when they called CTL, chronic training load fitness, I was like, oh, that might be the easy answer, but not the most correct answer, because training load is neutral. You could ride your bike at 5 miles an hour on the road, 4 hours a day for every day for 6 straight months. And the training load that responds to that might not really make you any faster in your local crit, right? Training load is neutral. Stress, that external number, it's linear. More is more. We add more stress, that's more. Strain is a problem child. It really is, right? Because there are a lot of variables we need to talk about. But the real challenge is adaptation plays by its own rules. So you have to put these 4 challenges, these 4 statements out there when you start talking about training load, so that you really build an understanding that there is a science here, but there is an art that really gets needed. If you remember my last webinar about training with data, what I said about expertise and mastery, you can never become a training load master without the art, without really practicing this, because the science only helps you make better decisions. There is no clear answer here. I've seen some really great questions coming up, but the answer isn't as clear as we want it to be. You, the artist, the master, still have to make decisions. So let's look at this. Training response is a mix of linear and nonlinear. Let's break it down. Let's think about all training and adaptation as the reality is you have homeostasis, you disrupt that homeostasis, you introduce stimuli, right? And then the body attempts to return. It's always going to attempt to return to homeostasis. Often it needs a little bit of rest. But that homeostasis isn't the same homeostasis. It's an improved homeostasis, right? That's what it's trying to do. So when we think about stress and the way we currently measure things, stress is training load. The measurement metrics that we have of stress is training load. And actually, we can fine-tune that training load by looking at training intensity duration. How much, how hard did we go at this training level or at this optimized target? You know, how much time in sweet spot, all those things, right, that we talk about, that's training intensity distribution. But you're still talking about external measurements, what we're applying to the system, right? Those two are highly related. The system then goes under strain. And the question becomes, well, why don't we have a strain score and just figure out strain? There are too many variables. I've seen other software claim to be able to do it. And you know what? They probably can give sort of general bell curve guidance. But to me, that's a worse answer than a well-educated athlete or a well-educated coach using the data we have to make good decisions instead of letting some computer system that cannot collect all the variables. It doesn't know exactly what you've eaten. It doesn't know exactly how fatigued you are. It doesn't know how much other life stress you have. It doesn't know the environment you're training in. There's just too many unknowns, right? So strain has all those variables. And the other challenge is with those variables, it is a non-linear response. And I'm going to show you a visual that I think can bring this together in a moment, meaning what I want to happen, right, which would make coaching easy and we could automate everything. If I apply 10 stress points, I gain 10 strain points. Then I have this very clear relationship, right? All I need to do is figure out a way to get 10 stress points and I'll get 10 strain points. The reality of our bodies is you apply 10 stress points, maybe some days you get 15 strain points and some other days you get 3. And if you start taking that over chronic, like time range, it gets even harder, right? Once we go through this strain, there's actually another variable you have to think about: how our body sends the adaptive signal. See, when we apply stress and the body goes under strain, the next step responses are systems, I'm just going to generalize and oversimplify here, send an adaptive signal saying, holy crap, we're under some stress, right? And we need to make change. Hence we're off the homeostasis status. We need to make change. That adaptive signal gets sent and it needs to be received. And as it's received, right, it actually has to be received by one system, but then the repair work that's necessary is a system specific, right? Because you create a different relationship. Let's just take cardiovascular strain and neuromuscular strain. Go out and do 4 hours of low gear climbing or 90 minutes of high cadence, high power efforts. You're going to create different systematic response. One might have more cardiovascular strain. One might have more neuromuscular strain. And that each of those could be further broken down, but I'm just keeping it simple. So your stress is clean and linear, but all these challenges go on. And adaptation really is just your body's ability to return back to a new homeostasis. And you have to rest to turn that on. So training load, this nice thing that we like to keep very simple and clean, and which it is when we think about stress, has a lot more complexity, needs a lot more of the art form. So let's look at this as a stress strain adaptation example in a slightly different way. This is not a chart. I just pasted together some lines to use this as an example. So don't put this on the Facebook group and be like, here's what Tim said, how it works. It does kind of work like this, right? Let's say we went out and did 100 TSS every day, right? Stress would go up in a linear fashion. The reality is the strain you go under would not be so linear. And even more specifically, the adaptation would take on its own, maybe sort of related, but in certain ways can be totally unique because we don't have all the variables in that mix, right? We don't understand. So what does that mean? That's the art of cooking. You guys, here it is. Here's the science. These are the art. This is the science. We can measure external load. Now, what I mean by that, right, we're going to get into definitions here in a little bit using the PMC chart. I'm just going to go quickly through because people ask for a better definition of the chart usage. But the reality is this straight line, if you did 100 TSS every day, which I would not recommend, by the way, it would be linear, right? We just have this chronic training load. There is a half-life and other things, but the reality is it would just keep going up and up and up till it maxed out, per your 100. That's easy to do. But being able to relate that to the strain that's occurring in the adaptation, there lies the magic. So Steve asks a great question. I'm going to say this: is training load always neutral, therefore whatever the level? Yes. The load, like the total stress, remember that's external stress. So when I say load is measured by stress is linear, I'm talking about the external load we're putting on. More is always more. Your body, when you're measuring stress, right? If you could do 5,000 watts, a ride, you'd do 5,000 watts. More is just more. But that has no direct, no completely linear relationship with strain and adaptation. Load is neutral. So I'm going to jump to standards, then back to PMC definition, because I thought it would make more sense to do it this way. Only you will know. So let's talk about a couple of the core questions I saw in Facebook group of training load. Remember, training load, hopefully I've given a good understanding that we're going to be talking about the external load. I'll translate back to the adaptation and strain and adaptation at times. But right now I want to talk about the external load, which is what chronic training and acute training loads are measuring. Two areas of questions I received was the impact of aging and individualization. And I already have this question here once or twice. Here lies the problem, right? I should have done this as a chart. I thought about it afterwards, like as a graph. So I'll kind of do it in my little camera here. And let's say we start training at the age 16. I'm just randomly picking that age. From 16, and we're training somewhat reasonably, regularly. From 16 to 19, that's our first 3 years of training. We're pretty immature in training in that stage. Then maybe from 20 to 27, we keep training. We're not only now reasonably training mature, meaning let's assume we're just doing regular training each week, our training maturity is getting extreme, right? By the time we get into our 40s and 50s, the reality is if you've been training all your life, right, that's pretty extreme. So here lies the challenge of the aging individual and trying to figure out standardization. If I'm to look at 16 to 19-year-olds, they cluster closer together because they generally have the same background. They generally have the same physiology. For the 16 previous years, they've been kids and they've taken care of themselves probably pretty well, hopefully outside playing, a certain amount of physical activity. There's a lot of similarities. As they move into their 20s, there's actually not quite so many, but still there's a lot. Then 30s and 40s, that cluster, they might have clustered very similarly. Take 1,000 performing athletes, right? 16 to 19, they're a tight cluster. 20 to 29, they're still a pretty, 29 even to 30, they're still, by the time you get to 50, that cluster is this big. The variation gets so high with aging that you really have to rely on the understanding of two key factors. There is no, factor number one, there is no standardization. Throw it out the window. And here's why I'm going to tell you to do that. One, a lot of times that desire to standardize the aging athlete holds it back, makes you do too little, sometimes too much too, but holds it back, makes you do too little. I'm 55 years old. I train pretty hard. I like to ride my bike. I train pretty hard. I have a FTP goal each year is like my driver. I want to be able to go X amount of watts for an extended time period. That's my goal, right? And whether I race, don't race, that's kind of my measurement. What it's taken to get there has been a little different as I've aged, but not for me as much as you would think. Others, maybe. I've been training all my life. I've been an athlete since college and in high school, even in college, and I can withstand a lot. The answer, and I'm not saying that like for me, I'm not fast either. I can just withstand a lot. The reality is it's so individualized that it can hold you back. If I was to say, oh, well, we shouldn't train so hard, we're older, I would have to reduce my training 20%. And I guarantee you I'd get 15 to 25% slower. Because part two is there, and I learned this, I got to give credit to Dr. Coggin here. Andy gets credit here, and he's right. There is no greater indicator of your performance than history. So learning to understand stress, learning to understand training load, and utilizing analytics to better understand the athlete's actual performing history and applying that forward is the skill in dealing with aging athletes. Whether you're doing that on a standard training load, how high should I raise my CTL, which I'm going to show you some standards here. Or even Stephen asks, what ATL, should it be 7 or 12? So I do slow down my ATL for aging athletes, but not to just some individual number. I still recover pretty well. I keep mine at 7 or 8. I'm just one of those people. I'm just lucky I return to homeostasis pretty quickly. I withstand training and I return. I can tell you major professional athletes in their 40s that I've had to slow theirs down to like 9 or 10. Really depends on the individual. Hence the term individualization. So there's my answer to that question. And I'm trying to answer questions better and obviously not going to do it quickly. The other is the question was the impact of transition change or on ramp rate. Load is neutral. So Stephen, it's a great question. And you always ask such good ones. The question was top indicators to identify when to change training load. My answer to that question is that lies in metabolic response in general. That lies in looking at the phase in training you're in, the physiological results that occur. Because remember what I said back in my physiology, my metrics versus power presentation? Oftentimes you'll see the change in the metric first, in the physiology. To me, that's the point of transition. That transition then changes how you manipulate the duration and intensity relationship of training for that athlete, which could impact your overall training load. And hopefully I said that well, because what I did is I reversed it, meaning the training load isn't the indicator of the change, or it is the result of the need of change. My prescription might be more load or less load, but that's driven by a different desire. You would see it in the training load, overarching training load, but a different desire. Hope that answers the question. I got another question, the great one, I'm going to tackle it here. Does adaptation, is it longer or harder as we age? You can't adapt as well, right? Your body does get a little older and shit gets slower. Oops, stuff gets slower. It happens, right? Whatever. But actually you can adapt pretty well. As we get older, really what gets us, the cost of regaining fitness is higher. So when we think about training load, if I have a 23-year-old, I have this young woman pro who just can train, like she can have ramp rates at like 9, 10 a week and just withstand it. So she can actually take a pretty good rest postseason. And then we get back at it, we can just load her up pretty hard, right? And she can get right back up, to a higher CTL. She can withstand that without a lot of chronic fatigue, without struggling. If I was to try to run a ramp rate of even 7, I'd be, asleep back there on that couch every day. So the cost is really high. So as we age, we actually need to manage our overall fitness more wisely. We need to take shorter rest periods, but we need to be better prepared to rest. Remember I said that, that's another webinar, because we don't want to have to rebuild so much that rebuilding creates a lot of chronic fatigue. Because what does happen as we age is, yes, we can apply the linear stress, but we actually undergo more strain for slightly, I don't want to say slower, like you said it, but lower adaptation. So we got to be careful of the cost of the fatigue of that journey as we age. Because of all the requests, I'm going to do an aging athlete and WKO webinar, but understand you're going to hear a lot of what I said. I don't know the answer. There isn't a specific answer. As we get older, the need for individualization gets more and more important. How's that for an answer? All right. Sorry, I'm out of webinar shape, man. I got to get in some miles. Let's talk about range and training maturity. When we talk about what's good chronic training load, now I have the definitions after this. I wanted to start with this for a purpose. Maybe I should have done it the other way. A low mature athlete, somebody's only in their first year or two of training. A lower amount of training would be under 40, a medium somewhere 41 to 75, and high 76. Chronic training load, TSS per day score. As they get into medium maturity, let's say 2 to, 4 or 5 years, depends exactly what they're doing. I would think a runner would mature a little bit faster than a cyclist due to the lesser efficient, the more demand, the little bit more micro trauma and other things that occur. But these are just good generalizations, say 2 to 5 years. Under 60, 61 to 95, above 96. Once we get highly mature, let's say training for 5 years plus, maybe a runner 3 years plus. Low is under 80, medium is 81 to 115, high is 116. Now, you might have been training for 20 years, look at my chart and be like, hey, Tim, my CTL only goes up to 75 every year. Yep, that might be, right? If you have 6 to 8 hours a week, it's pretty hard to get over 75 CTL. That is a time constraint, but it doesn't change the question that was asked. What are some, when I look at all the data, what are some of the ranges I can give you, right? But I will tell you how you progress training load is actually more impactful than the end status. And we'll get into it. Somebody asked me about maturity, older. maybe I would reduce those 10% over 50. But I would tell you the range, the individualization would be much broader. I don't have a great answer except maybe knock off 10%. Like I said, I ride my bike a fair amount. My CTL will get maybe to 125. I mean, I ride a fair amount and I do camps and other stuff. So certain times it's kind of hard. So, but is that for everybody? Maybe not. So maybe 10% less. Again, this is the norm. The question was, what is the standard? But the reality is, when you talk about individualizing load, history is the key. It really is. And I went into that more earlier. But let's talk about ramp rate. So I think if you're really, particularly as we age, it's important to pay more and more attention in your training. I think ramp rate can be more impactful because ramp rate actually hits your acute training load first, right? But then translates into your chronic training load. This is a chart I've put together. I've shown this in different certification programs on Training Peaks and stuff like that. And I'll show it again here. If you're talking about your ongoing ramp rate, this is your years of training maturity. Here's your weekly increase in ramp rate, right? If you're looking, and this idea that you can sustain this for 14 to 28 days without resting. Pick 15, pick 27 days. It depends. 3 on, 1 off kind of, training week schedule. I like the idea, to me, with most athletes, being able to increase ramp rate 5 to 8 per week is a pretty good target for anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks in a row. That's a pretty good target that you would put for most athletes. The reality is that is a measurement of the slope, right? The uptick of how much stress, remember, external, how much stress you're applying to the system. And that's if you're under 100 TSS or under 100 CL. Over 100 CTL, I actually slow it down. I've seen 1 or 2 articles who say more. My gut is no, don't do more because it's harder, right? You're already doing 18 hours a week, right? Or something like that. As you add more hours, keeping ramp rate high, that's a challenge, man. You're really giving yourself a pounding. So that's important to note. Now, again, and that was a good thing to write down. Here's another one. This idea is based on cycling. Running has more trauma to the body. I hate using the word trauma, micro trauma at a muscular level. Trauma sounds like I've run and now I'm laying on a stretcher in the ambulance, which actually would happen if I ran. That would be exactly me. But in reality it just has more, it's not as efficient as running, is not as efficient as cycling. I'm talking about the physiological efficiency. It has more trauma, more impact, which is great in some ways, bone density, other muscular responses, but it also takes a little more healing from that. Your immune system is working a little harder to repair. And for a runner, asking Steve Palladino on his website, he's probably the expert. But the reality is, I would say 15 to 20% less. But again, I would be more concerned about the runner's history. And here's the question I would ask for both groups, but particularly the runner. If they've been injured in the past, what was their ramp rate the 2 to 4 weeks leading into that injury? I would want to see if that was one of the causes. So history always gives us insight. I would want to make sure that and a runner, I would be more subject to err on the low side of training load. Because go back to my chart. I hate doing this because it's kind of bouncing around. The slope of this line, right, is ramp rate. And I can make it really steep or really shallow. The reality is ramp rate is the scoring of that reality. And you can determine more for short term. Go to a 7-10 day cycling camp and rack up a bunch of miles. You can withstand that. As a matter of fact, here's another tip for you. Most people go to a cycling camp, have a big TSS week, and then they rest more than they should afterwards, and they give it all back because they see that big gain, that big ramp rate, and they're like, oh, that's really bad. I need to rest forever. No, actually, if you went in with some fitness and you didn't get too bananas, so be careful what I'm saying, a short rest is actually the best way to capture that big training camp advantage. But that's tricky art, more advanced stuff for another day. When I'm talking CTL, this is confusing too. Sorry, but these are the training load questions. CTL is always the same week. And I think about it this way. What was my CTL Sunday night at midnight versus the CTL the next Sunday night at midnight? If it was 80 here first Sunday and 85 here the next Sunday, both at midnight, my CTL gain was 5. I know some ramp rate charts just use like a rolling ramp rate. I would not do that. It's week over week over week. The simplest thing you could do is look at your weekly summary. Oh, CTL was 85. Next week's summary, 90. Next week's summary, 95. Cool. 5 per week. Pretty good number. All right. I think I answered a lot of questions there. Okay. Okay, here's a good question by Alan. What range would you use if you've had some time off the bike? Would you class yourself as having high maturity? So Alan, the maturity is your overall training history. You don't lose that. Well, eventually you take 10 years off, 5 years off, maybe you lose it, but generally your maturity. If you've had an injury and coming back to the bike, if you've lost a lot of CTL, you can actually, as long as you've given yourself an appropriate amount of time to heal, because the healing, how well you've healed really is the driving factor of how much you can train. But if you're healed and ready to train, probably because your CTL went down over that injury, you could probably jump right back in, because training stress and the increase in CTL is related to where you're at on that CTL chart. So the reality is you're probably still okay, but it's the injury that's the guide, not the ramp rate. The ramp rate just shows what you did coming back, but you don't lose your maturity. It takes 5 years. I've seen plenty of professional cyclists retire and be pretty fast, barely riding their bike for the next couple of years because they maintain, they've had all that luxury. Now that wears off over time, but it works. Okay, moving on, tracking training load. So the way we track training load is the performance manager chart. Mark asked to make sure that we always say what the chart names are and explain how to use it. I'm not going to go too deep here because I think everybody will understand the performance management chart. This is the one I use. It's the one that we put in the advanced package, performance manager chart with insights. I have a couple of editions of which I'm going to show you some, and not all, but I'm going to give you some hints about all. This is chronic training load. I like the insights because I like seeing when they're overreaching, when they're in the green, and when they're overreaching, when they're in the optimal training load. This is an athlete, 2 peak season. Green is when they want to be optimal. You want to see some red, by the way, in your training load in the PMC. You need periods of overreach. That's part of the game. First build, you can see the build in nice little cycles, a little bit of summer racing, midsummer big event, but not the A event. Rest, build back, hard push, big late fall event. You can see the big overreach going into that. So pretty simple, CTL, ATL, and then really this is just TSP. So what do those mean? So chronic training load, I'm not going to read all these because I assume you guys know, but I will make sure that this presentation is in the notes of the video so you can download it. But training chronic load, or CTL, chronic training load, provides a measure of how much an athlete has been training, and that considers volume and intensity, historically or chronically. And that really, I can stop there. This is your long-term training history based on an exponentially weighted movement average, right? That builds or declines over time. That's all it's really telling you. And it's only indicative of the actual load. To me, it might have correlation to your fitness and performance, but is not the causality. It's related, but it can't be considered the absolute cause. Acute training load, which is the purple here, and I just grabbed some different images, right? That's the short-term load. And what you're basically seeing here is chronic training load in blue and acute training load. So you see chronic is climbing, acute is high, little rest period, right? A little bit of recovery, super compensation cycle or a general adaptation syndrome cycle, gas, little build, little rest, little build, little rest, little more build, a little rest, right? You see this is very well executed. You see the acute training load and the big response, you rest, recover, fatigue. Now, one of the things that I do in the relationship, I do a lot of my training load planning by using, and it's funny, the same question kind of got answered in Facebook today. I think you guys are like stalking me. And I need to do this in the long version. The relationship between your chronic training load and your daily TSS planning, you can actually use your chronic training load to plan the TSS scores of each week. And it's a percentage based. You can target things as a percentage of CTL. I'll get into that more in my more in-depth webinar in early 2022. TSB, I'm not going to get into. That's just the training stress balance. This just, one of the, well, I don't want to get into it. I'll get into my longer, you guys, sorry, I'm supposed to keep it simple and short. Training stress balance, really, we can call it form, right? And that really is this balance between how much fitness you have built, how much training load you have built, and then how much rest have you given, or how low fatigue you have. It's not necessarily rest, it's how much you've reduced fatigue. But it also is an interesting indicator how well you've adapted to your short-term training load. But we'll get into that more deeply. Now, just some thoughts as I show the PMC. It's an art, and it's an art of individualization. What is a struggle for all of us, and let's go watch my training with data webinar, is we read the book, we see the numbers, we have a standard, and that makes us an expert. But the expertise doesn't matter. You might understand it really, really well, right? And that's cool, and you should. That should be the basis. But you need to be able to learn to apply it and manage it. It's an art of individualization, because no matter, there are general principles in overload and training load management, but it's an individual art. And all of the metrics we like to take from that, they're all dependent on the other metrics. Meaning I could raise CTL by doing a massive ATL, but I'm not going to get faster. I'm not going to perform. They're all related to each other. I could do a 1200 TSS week. A good pro can do 1200 TSS week more commonly than you might even think, right? But the reality is that's dependent on the fact that they're doing that at a 135 CTL or a 145 CTL, and they've maintained that off, through the season for the last 5 years. They're all related to each other. CTL is not fitness. It's not. It's your training load. As I just hinted out in the past slide, ATL is a measure of possible change in performance due to fatigue. Goes high, right? And people miss this in how, when you look at your athletes' results too much. When ATL goes high, you can typically expect an inconsistent performance out of your athlete. Not always bad. Sometimes they pop off a good one in there because they're on the ragged edge, right? They're overreaching, but they tend to become very inconsistent. And more often or not, they struggle. And then suddenly they get fresh and they overperform. And they're like, this is awesome. I'm way stronger than I think I am, until they start adding some load. ATL, if you connect the quality of workouts, like how your athlete scores them, to ATL, you will always, I hate saying always, but most of the time you will find a pattern. And TSB is not a predictor of performance ability. It really isn't. It helps us understand it, but it's not a predictor. It's just a good indicator of how fully you adapted you are to training. You need to rest. Remember my last cycle, adaptation, return back to homeostasis needs rest. TSB, so like for me, I'll give you an example. I don't have a professional athlete who truly tapers into a big event. Not a single one. None of them can taper into a big event. Now, I'm cyclist. I don't coach any triathletes at this time, and rarely ever do, because I can't run or swim, so it's a problem. But the reality is, what I will do is rest them some amount of days out. Let's say 10 to 14. That's where I rest. I let the TSB come high, right? We rest them so they achieve that new homeostasis. But now often they're too fresh, they're ATL, they're too fresh to perform really well. So then we load back into a big performance. And if you think about what I just said, you're going to be like, oh crap, that helps me understand why tapering can be so hard, because we've over-related TSB to this prediction of performance. There's a relationship. You can look at the data and make some general guesses, but the direction, the ramp rate of your ATL and CTL going into the event are super important. So for most of us, look, some people do need the taper. They just do better really, really fresh. Do a British hill climb, right? You're going to want to be super fresh. Otherwise than that, actually resting out so your TSB gets fully recovered, gets positive, let's just say, right? Yeah, Steve Palladino, that's a great point. TSB is a degree of homeostasis disruption. When your TSB comes back to 0, you're back on the new homeostasis, then train a little to get yourself open for the race. You only need a couple of harder, not like 5 times 5 max efforts. You might need 2 or 3 times 3, right? You need a couple of hard efforts to get that ramp rate going back up so the body switched back on. Oversimplification. So think about load that way. Those are those 3 and how you can use them. All right, so let's talk about what I received, and I have 4 slides left. And there's just no way I can do a short webinar. You guys can totally throw me under the bus. It just doesn't happen. But I'm actually tackling a lot of the questions here, I think. I do use the performance manager chart with insights. The question we received very frequently is, how do we integrate training load with metrics like RPE, HRV, and other? I like simple charts in general, but my super secret chart, which I don't share here, you guys. I mean, to be honest with you, I've been coaching and learning and everything for 17 years, and I do all these webinars for free, but to put it out publicly, it's not even fair to my athletes who come to me to perform to beat other athletes, at a high level. There are certain things that, I keep proprietary, but I'm going to give you some ideas how we do that. My only complex chart I have in my entire set is my PMC chart. I pack a whole lot of stuff in there, man. It's crazy. I open my PMC chart and literally all the lights in the neighborhood go brown. Like my neighbors know when I'm reading the PMC chart. So let's start. And I'm going to try to give credit here. The other thing, you guys, there's so much cool stuff in the Facebook group that I know it's kind of hard to find at times, but it really is an excellent think tank. I'm going to try to give credit to the people who invented these. I did a bad job of that in my last webinar. I forgot to thank Steve for one of the charts I stole from him and somebody else. I want to make sure I'm doing that well. HRV, adding HRV to the PMC chart. Here's just a very short-term view. You see the faded green? This is a super smart way to look at HRV. I do look at HRV, but it is not a required metric I force my athletes to have. You can ask me that opinion later. I don't train by HRV. If they're tracking it because actually there's other data, I'm way more interested in their sleep data and some other things than I am in their actual HRV. Not saying it's useless data. I just don't use it to coach by. When I have it, it's nice, but I don't require my athletes to use an HRV monitoring device. But Simon and I think Steve, you helped on this chart, and Crispin, you guys put together something pretty cool here that I stole an element of. I was already kind of doing it, but you guys did it smarter because you're smarter. I would like to look at, when I look at HRV, let's start with this. I'm always using an exponentially weighted moving average. I never pay attention to the day. I look at it, but it doesn't impact me. I'm looking at the exponentially weighted moving average over 7 days. A rolling 7-day average is what I look for. Now, way I fine-tuned that more, and I stole this from Steve Palladino because he was doing it with training intensity score, which is on the next slide, is I now use the training load function, the TL function, so it matches my acute training load number. So, which for most of my athletes is 7 days, but the reality is when I adapt that, I like for maybe an aging athlete like myself, I run about 8 or 9 on me until I get pretty fit, and then I go back to 7. It correlates pretty well. I see a better relationship. There's a clear relationship between acute training load and HRV. So instead of using the exponentially weighted moving average, I'm just linking it to the training load metric score and using it that way, which gives me a cleaner, better look. And then I'm just looking at a range of it in the chart. You see here it being dashed out. Another metric being used, and I know Richard Rawlinson shared a bunch of these, is the chronic intensity load. This was created way back when WKO was launched. This is horrible. I'm going to forget who did it. Pretty good coach out of Boulder area. If it comes back to me, I'll remember. And it's in the chart. Make sure you look and always give credit to the people that help us out. And he's tracking in here this chronic intensity load, which takes the idea of TSS and just applies more intensity to it, meaning it tries to give us, I'm sorry, not the right way to say it. It looks to better understand the TSS CTL relationship by giving some insight into a rolling intensity, like how much intensity impacted that TSS. So we understand when TSS is coming from a higher intensity and from a lower intensity. That's a pretty good chart. I don't use it, to be honest with you, because I'd rather plan that. But I've used it at times to be diagnostic, to look back at what athletes were doing. CIL. Here is what it looks like if you just chart it out. There's the expression. That being said, and I should have, and the simplest place to find it all, there is a chart called Tri-CIL at the athlete level, Tri-CIL, which has run, bike, swim, CIL in it. So it's way easier to copy and paste than it is to write all that down, isn't it? So go to your whiteboard dashboard, open your whiteboard, load this chart and steal the expressions and build them into whatever you might want to build them into. The same can be done with the HRV expressions in this chart. And I show the chart name. It's right here. That's in the Facebook group. And there's similar ones. Just search HRV in the chart library. Now, I built one and shared with you called Training Intensity Score in the PMC. This was how I used to do it, one chart with 3 blocks. And I was looking at, when intensity was higher. But then Steve came along. And it was funny, Steve, I love this comment you had in Facebook. It was great, because this is how I think. Went for a walk and had another idea, right? That's where all the genius happens, when we shut our brains down a little. And it was Steve's idea to build this idea of a chronic and acute training intensity score. You guys, the reason Kevin and myself and the team, we invented training intensity score was training stress score is an external measurement. It's only an external measurement. We don't know what's happening internally in strain. We can sort of predict, but we don't know. Training intensity score, training intensity score. So doing it like being able to score the aerobic and the anaerobic score by training impact score gives us greater insight into what systems we were banging away on as we were applying that stress, right? That does give us some good insight into strain, because at least it tells us what we were straining. Steve took it on a chronic approach and began to play with, and has a bunch of different charts in there about using exponentially weighted moving average. And then the idea is to, you can use the training load function and look at it over time also. And here you see in his chart, he's looking at chronic and acute, super smart. Go back to my original slide. It's the way we should look at all training load, all applied training, right? Always look at acute and chronic, because they're related, but it's not as cause out. It's not as this causes this nice clean as you think. So Steve, I thought that was a really great breakthrough idea. I will tell you, you can blend them all together. I took my PMC, and there's one other metric here. I thought I put the slide in here. I must have deleted it by mistake. I was trying to shorten it. But I take my PMC, I track HRV, I track aerobic impact, anaerobic impact, ramp rate, and sleep, RPE, workout feelings, and for my female athletes, I track cycle. That's everything that's in my PMC, which I thought I had a slide that I was going to kind of show it here, but I must have deleted it like a dumbass. This is a great way. You want to figure out how you could, just using a 7-day average, how you can get the TIS in there. There's a chart. Did I fail in my mission? There's a chart that was created. I'm trying to see if the name, and Steve, you're on here. You might know the name of the chart. Type it in the questions if you know it. You were one of the two who built it. Chronic training load with training impact or something like that it is. And it tracks, and there you can go in and, again, steal the expressions and build them into yours. Sorry, I lost a slide. But I will tell you what's missing from my slide. I do something, sometimes you just do something. Like sometimes there's like some simple metric that doesn't make perfect physiological stress. You know what I track every year with athletes? Because I always am looking at season comparisons. Cumulative TSS. Just cum sum, parens, TSS. And it makes a little line across the page. But what you can, and the line's always going up, right? Because it's cumulative. And the reality is, the way I use that is, one, I'm looking for accelerations, which would always match your ramp rate. But two, when you overlay multiple seasons, you get some interesting learning. Go into your WKO this afternoon, right? Just start a new chart and put cum sum TSS, and then grab an athlete and look at the last 3 seasons. And you will see an interesting result in changes in timing as you were, and the impact of when you were piling on TSS or not piling on TSS. It's pretty interesting learning. Sorry, I missed that. I had the slide with that on there, but it's this in between holiday season. I'm always a little off my game. All right, let's move to open Q&A. So a couple of questions I got from the Facebook group, and then I'll take the rest of the ones in the question box. Training load for the triathlete. Is it possible to use with bike, swim, run? Yes, absolutely. There's plenty of PMCs for triathletes. Just Google search, open WKO5, open the view or the chart libraries or the dashboard libraries, and just search PMC tri or multi-sport. And you'll find plenty of options to track all 3. How to track training load by quality, i.e. intensity and duration. Marcelo, that's the magic. It really is, right? And I don't think you can track it as well as you can plan it and then see if you had compliance. It really is something that more is a planning mechanism. There are some tricks that I've done in other webinars to track it, but the reality is it's the art. It's the mastery side of it, because more isn't always more. When you do just general volume, riding around your bike pretty easy, let's call it metabolic level 1, the 3-zone system, ride your bike a lot, no big deal. You'll get fitter and fitter and fitter till you're not going to anymore, but you're not creating super high fatigue on you. You're not, well, I shouldn't say eventually you might create some damage. Go out and do some intensity and more intensity and less intensity. That's where things can go wrong for you reasonably quick. So as we add intensity, it's more about the art. All right, rocking through questions now. Ask them if you have them. Tim, I seem to experience this with myself. This was way at the beginning, Kurt, and sorry I didn't tackle it at the time. Tim, I seem to experience this with myself, but does it hold true typically for most people that cardio strain recovers quicker than muscular strain for a given load? Does it recover more quickly? Yes. Quickly might not be the right way to say it. The cost of recovery is lower, which means the time constraints to recovery might be lower. When you do muscular strain, you are creating, wow, and this is an oversimplification, but you are creating, go back to this idea of micro trauma. When you do I'm going to military press, right, or bench press, right, a big weight, I'm doing micro trauma at the muscular level. I'm damaging fibers. Now I need to call in some proteins, some amino acids. I need to repair those fibers. I need work to be done. Cardiovascular strain really is something that that type of fatigue is Your heart has been challenged. It has been stretched a little, right, to do some additional work. Its elasticity has been challenged. So the adaptation really isn't a total rebuild. It's just improvement in elasticity, maybe some growth in size. So it is easier to go that direction. If you think about cardiovascular, the same thing happens. The other part of cardiovascular, you have intake, what your heart is doing, but you have uptake at the molecular level, that muscle working when I'm doing that exercise. Your mitochondria go through the same experience. They expand, your capillaries expand. None of that is rebuilding, where at a muscular level, the way you're saying it, that takes rebuilding. That's building block, harder work. So it can take more time and energy. The ramp rate metric that WKO5 uses, top left by the athlete, is that a rolling one? No, great question. I should have answered it. I think I sort of answered at the time, but in WKO, we fix ramp rate from Sunday at midnight, hopefully whatever the regional setting your computer is to the next week. So we fix it to the week. It is not rolling because it's a better way to do it. Training Peaks rolls it. So I know that's a difference. Franz, how much is the influence of the way the CTL was created, high intensity? Fran, it's a huge difference. And that's exactly the whole point of individualization, right? If I went out and got 100 TSS points a day by riding a 90-minute ultimate crit every day, or 100 TSS points by riding a 3-hour very casual ride, the training stress, the chronic training load would look exactly the same, right? It's linear, but my response, the strain would be different, right? So whereas sorry, I'm going to jump back here. Nobody have a seizure. So those same 100 points applied every day would make the same stress line, but the strain and the adaptation would be dramatically different, wouldn't it? That's exactly the point, where you need to learn to master these elements. Training load is neutral. You have to learn, there's ways to figure out what strain that is putting the athlete under. Heart rate is the simplest strain. Go 200 watts, what's their heart rate? Now go 300 watts, what's their heart rate? That is a change in stress and a change in strain metric. Strain is internal, and so your heart rate is internal, right? But it's a complex answer. It's a art form. Victor asks, if I'm not meeting performance targets, e.g. power in a session, should I continue for the sake of building or stop since I may be acquiring non-productive fatigue? Victor, another magic question, right? It depends if you're tired. So if the number one mistake I see people make, so I'll answer it just from a coaching way. Where did I do that? Is right here. See this chronic training load and this acute training load? I just did this. I just picked up, I started working with a new athlete this year, very good pro, let's just say Northern European, been coached by their federation. And I look back at their seat and they had a really bad year. They started to get coached last year at a high level and had a really bad year. First year, like full on pro-ish. And I looked at their ATL and their CTL, and their ATL stayed way above CTL the whole way. And CTL just went up, 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 up every day until mid-race season. No brass break, no rest, no off. It was just game on every day. And when she came to me and I kind of was showing her some stuff, I said, if you were to describe, one word, you can only use one word. What was your feeling of every workout this summer? Like this workout, this workout, this workout, that's what I was doing. You know what that word was? I'm tired. But nobody stopped and said, well, maybe you should rest. That's where people don't understand the basic principles of exercise physiology. GAS, general adaptation syndrome, sometimes called supercompensation. People need periods of on and then rest and recovery, on, rest and recovery, on, rest and recovery. So if you've always been on, Victor, absolutely rest. Because what typically happens when you're always on, you don't overtrain. And that's a shame. You should overtrain, because if you overtrain, you'd come apart, right? You'd have to stop. What ends up happening, you enter into an extended period of non-functional overreaching, meaning you're just recovered enough to do one more workout. I can do that tomorrow. If I just sleep and eat perfect and do everything perfect, I can just barely meet the minimum expectation of that next workout. And you do that day in, day out, but you never get faster. As a matter of fact, you slowly start getting slower because you're just non-functionally overreaching. Yeah, I can do the work, but my body is too tired to adapt. It can't return to the new homeostasis. It's too fatigued. So ATL might help you make that decision. That's always my point with data. Data helps you make better decisions, but it is not the decision. So if you see a high ATL, an ongoing ATL high, an ongoing ramp rate of CTL, and you're feeling that way, hell yeah, take some time off. You'll get faster, dude, and start again. A couple of weeks, then rest again, start again. More is rarely ever more. Actually, more often could be more, but be careful. Richard says, HRV is also very useful to track quality of recovery from sleep, nutrition, etc. HRV does give us some good insight into recovery. Good point, Richard. Simon. Appreciate it's individual, but do you feel there's a point of diminishing returns for higher training load? Simon, that's a great question, man. I should have covered that in my thing. Yes, there is absolutely a point of diminishing returns. I'm probably going to get crucified for this, but it depends on the athlete's history, right? So it is individualized to some degree, but I would say that's somewhere between 135 and 165 on a CTL. I mean, I know Grand Tour riders who get over that amount, and the Grand Tour itself drags them over that. But if you think about what like a Grand Tour does to a professional cyclist, they're basically killing themselves slowly. It's not. And then it's like, and if it was true, and during the Grand Tour, I've seen 180 to 200, right? CTL. Then you wonder why they don't come back from the Tour or from the Giro and can't win the Tour. Well, you'd think, well, they did all that great training load, right? Their CTL was really high after the Tour. They should be or after the Giro, they should be very fit for the Tour. No way. It's just too much CTL, diminishing return. When I start with a new younger athlete, I make 3-year plans always with the younger pro. We escalate max CTL each year by some number, usually like 10 or 15 CTL points. It depends on what I see in their history and ability. So I might go to 115 year 1, 125 year 2, 135 year 3. Then, once they're experienced, I'll train in the 140 to 155 range, maybe for pre-peak experiences, but no higher, because the fatigue, the cost is just way too high at that point. They never adapt. They can't recover enough to get into that adaptation. Does it make sense to add TSS from swim, bike, and run? Does the analysis sum? When it comes to multi-sport PMCs, I have 4 things I track: swim, bike, run, and all. Always track them all together. The problem is the fatigue from each is different. My opinion, I'm not an expert on these. The fatigue from the running is highest, cycling is next, swimming tends to be the lowest. That could be totally wrong. Everybody put their own opinion. So you can't apply one size fit all number to it. Even though I do want to see the overarching number, I want to manage them independently. So the answer is both. Manuel asks, isn't TSS already somewhat a strain view on how an applied external, expended energies in kilojoules, does strain the body? No, it's a good question. And this was discussed a lot because I don't know if you guys can see all the questions. It's a harder question to read. Did I go by my piece? I did. Hold on. That's what I was looking for. So the question is, isn't strain TSS already sort of a metric of strain and applied external stress as expended energy in kilojoules? No, so the reality is TSS is based off normalized power. Normalized power was never meant to be a strain indicator specifically. What it was meant is to better understand the quantity of strain placed on the system, because we already knew that work, the physiological work, kilojoules of work is based on average power. And the reality is, if you went as hard as you could, as easy as you could, hard as you could, as easy as you could for an hour, or just went a straight, steady 200 watts, and they both ended up averaging 200 watts, the physiological cost is not the same. That's why we made normalized power so we can do a better job of measuring the external strain on this, the external stress on the system. And you see people now, I see some pretty well-known scientists, and I'm going to tell you guys this right now, credit to Dr. Andy Coggan. And if anybody else wants to argue the fact, I'll tell them where they can put their argument. They come back and they keep saying training stress score has problems because it doesn't measure the strain, or it doesn't measure the internal, or it can have different types of strain based on how it's created. No shit. There's my hard answer. I'm tired of hearing that argument, right? We knew that when we created it. The reason, or when Andy created it, sorry, I shouldn't say it that way. When Andy created it with the power user group, with a lot of people giving great input, the end argument was this: we wanted something that was truly quantifiable, that wasn't subject to variables and oddities and stuff like that. We wanted the linear measurement. We talked about that when we launched it. Back in the day, everybody knew. But now everybody's saying, oh, it doesn't do this, this, and this. We knew that when we launched it. It was never meant to replace the art form of coaching. It was meant to help you make better decisions. Now everyone argues, but here's my point, right? Credit to Dr. Coggan. For everybody out there who's criticized training stress score, have you noticed? No one's ever found a better way. Show me that better score. Tell me what it is. Post it up in the Facebook group. Because Andy knew that the simplest, most functional answer would be the one that would survive over time and be the most useful. Stress. The one we knew we could truly quantify. So credit where credit's due. Sorry, that's my rant these days. Not that I care. I think it's great that people challenge things, and I think people should challenge things, but I also think we should be respectful of history. That's all. Yeah, thanks for the short webinar. Sorry. I told you I wasn't capable. I claimed it right up front. Does Training Peaks ATP use the same constant as WKO for ramp rate? Yes, but it rolls. Same idea. Ramp rate is just a simple metric of change, Richard. Stephen asks, how often do you test FTP to ensure your load indicators are consistent? My process is always the same when it comes to testing. I do baseline testing, which if you want to find baseline testing, go to the education center in WKO5, look up Coach and Train with WKO. It's lesson number 1. I do a full baseline test, and then I test once every 4 to 6 weeks in the unstructured format. That's my general norm when I'm working individual with athletes. Sometimes I'll do a specific test for a reason, but once I have the baseline, I just follow unstructured testing every 4 to 6 weeks. You want that to be reasonably accurate, but I do it as a rolling 4 to 6 weeks. Watch the video, you'll get the answer. Dina asks, interested to know and how you proxy for TSS in the gym. Obviously, CNS strain doesn't equal cardiovascular strain, but that's something that I feel is missing. Yes, when we designed, or when TSS was designed, it was a metabolic stress, and it never took into account strength training. But yet strength training creates fatigue and needs to have some role in the PMC, right? I just use my personal technique, I use a fixed number of TSS for a workout, and I separate it out from my PMC. So I track it, and I do look at the total, but meaning the total from cycling or running or whatever sport, and plus the strength. But the reality is I just fix a number and use it there so I can anticipate the fatigue. Next question. Is there any way to manually add TIS score to a workout? I would like to add this for long runs. Friends, it's TIS, training impact score, is calculated automatically. Just search TIS for running in your chart library. The reason yours might not be populating, you might have the cycling one open, so it's looking at cycling power. Find the one for running. And it does require running with power. It's a power metric. And the final question, could I use heart rate TSS for the gym? I would not. You might use it just to see how it help you set your guess, but I would not. Heart rate TSS really is just kind of binning what your heart rate is doing. It's just binning it into certain bins. In the gym, that might not be reflective of the strain. So I usually use a set number. I would tend to think heart rate TSS would be too low. Here's what I use. I use 20 TSS points per half an hour. That's what I use. Why? Because it sounded pretty much like the right number. It's just so I'm consistent. So if they spend an hour in the gym, it's 50. If they spend a half an hour, it's 25. That's higher than most people. Remember, I track it separately from my PMC. I do look at a total number, but at the core of my PMC, I track it separately. That being said, when I'm really doing the most amount of strength work with my athletes, they tend not to be riding a lot of intensity. That's why it's all tricky. It's all you have to look at. I do want to know the fatigue is there, but the reality is by the time I really get into where I'm highly specific in training, the strength training is kind of fading into the maintenance mode at best. All right, last question. When you do formal testing, the TSS is higher, which could alter the numbers in recovery weeks. Would you recommend doing these tests the last week of the mesocycle or after recovery? Wow, that's a great question, Fabian. It's a really great question. From a physiological sense, right, I always test after rest because you are looking, and this is what the model actually helps, the power duration curve model actually helps, right? We want just that maximal performance. So that's rule number one. Rule number two is after resting means I want them to do a day or two of work and get everything up and running again. I don't want them to test cold or they'll tend to, what I mean is like, let's say they take 3 to 5 days off in a cycle and they take 3 days off and 2 days easy riding. Then if you just slam right into the test, a lot of my athletes, they're not going to do well like that. They need a good work day. They need to put some load in the system before they'll test well. So again, comes back to the art of it, but I would always rest them. At the end of the mesocycle, fatigue might show up too much in the actual test result itself. Now, I got to be honest, I do fatigue resistance testing like 2-3 times a year. I do that at the end of a cycle. I want to see how fatigue resistant the athlete is. I want to load them up and see what they can take. So that's different though. You guys, another cognizant, training is testing, testing is training. You can put so much more testing into your training. We under limit our ability to go and look at historical performance, create historical data, create milestones and markers and be able to measure against them. All right, everybody, that was the short webinar. Thank you for joining us for it. As always, I appreciate the time. I will get this recorded and posted up. I'll put the presentation in the notes on YouTube so you can download it right from Dropbox. Talk to everybody soon. Bye now.